Okay, Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. So we ended off last week covering the period of the Tanzimat. And the Tanzimat was a massive centralization campaign on the part of the Ottomans to really transform the Ottoman Empire into a state. That is, an institution that possesses complete control over the use of violence. Now, I don't have the time to unpack all of that because that's what I spent an hour doing last week. But where we left off, we saw that there were a few things that happened. One is that there was enormous discontent, particularly on the part of Ottoman Muslims, who were the overwhelming majority of the subject population. There was enormous discontent at the abolishment of the Sharia and of the inability of the Ottomans to stifle the ever-increasing flow of missionaries. We also saw that the situation of the Jews and the Christians changed, astronomically for the better, just suddenly and very quickly. And the reasons for that were multifold, but at least one of them was the fact that the money that was flowing into the Ottoman Empire to the missionary organizations was often flowing through indigenous Christians and Jews. So, in other words, the great powers of Europe were often using clients inside the Ottoman Empire and were funneling money through them for whatever projects that they were trying to pursue. The end consequence of that was a massively improved situation of the Christians and Jews vis-a-vis their Muslim neighbors. Okay. The religious tension that emerged from that was something that we spent a lot of time on last week. And we also spoke about the land reform laws that the Ottomans had instituted for the purpose of collecting more taxes, for the purpose of improving their centralization. The consequence of that, though, is still being felt today in Palestine. One of the things that I mentioned, this was kind of like the closing point that one of the closing points that I finished off on, was that a huge percentage of Palestinian peasants, and not just Palestinian peasants, that happens to be my area of expertise, that's why I'm using them as the example, but a huge percentage of the peasants in the Ottoman peripheries no longer own the land that they lived on because of these centralization campaigns. Now, in the question and answer, you are more than welcome to ask a question about what I mean by that. I'm going very quickly because this is what I spoke about last week. So, you have a situation where the Ottomans have pursued a secularization campaign that has caused very, very high levels of resentment. You have a situation of ethnic and religious tensions. You have an increase in separatism. You have all of these things happening. And on top of all of that, none of these policies, which were designed to keep the great powers of Europe at bay, not a single one of these policies worked. Meaning, and this will be very familiar to an audience full of Muslims, the Ottoman Empire was engaging in a series of reforms, some of which were to strengthen itself and compete with Europe, but many of which were to appease Europe, to keep them satisfied, to keep them quiet, to keep them away. And again, as Muslims, we recognize this, right? The Ottomans were saying, you want us to treat the Christians better? We will treat the Christians better. You want us to abolish the Sharia? We have abolished the Sharia. You want us to do these things, to engage in these reforms? We are doing all of these things. Will you now leave us alone? And the great powers of Europe gave a resounding no. And so, in this environment, various Ottoman thinkers on both and when I say Ottoman, I mean Ottoman era thinkers, on both the Arabic-speaking side of the divide as well as the Turkish-speaking side, began to view the need for a return to a more Islamically oriented empire. Okay? Now, you had things like the Young Ottoman movement, you had the rise of figures like Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani. You had, all over the Muslim world, you had a need. there was the emergence of an idea that we need to simultaneously modernize, but also not lose who we are. And just like the Greek revolt and separatism and tyranny and the pains of decentralization gave birth to the Tanzimat, the need to both return to an Islamic identity and simultaneously modernize gave birth to Sultan Abdul Hamid. Now, I mentioned in the first session, and I'm going to say this, I title Sultan Abdul Hamid the final sultan. But most of you probably already know Sultan Abdul Hamid was not actually the final sultan. But I call him that because he was the last real sultan. He was the last sultan to actually have any real power. After Sultan Abdul Hamid, it's just figureheads. They're just puppets for a military regime. But Sultan Abdul Hamid was the last sultan to have real power. I mentioned in the first session, and I'm going to repeat this very quickly, when Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam was on his deathbed, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu an and Umar bin Khattab radiyallahu an, they told the Ansar, the Amir al-Mu'mineen, the one who succeeds Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, must be from Quraysh. And for a very long time, the Umayyads were from Quraysh, the Abbasids were from Quraysh. The Ottomans were the first rulers of the Muslim world to rule with any broadly recognized legitimacy as the Khulafa, but were not from Quraysh. And that did not matter for a very long time because things were good. Things were going well. If things are going well and people's bellies are full and crusaders are not knocking down our cities and Bedouins are not pillaging our villages and, things are moving well and, we're paying the Ottomans taxes and things are going well, that's fine. Okay, you're Amir al-Mu'mineen, you're Amir al-Mu'mineen. But when things are not going well, and I think you've gathered that by the rise of Sultan Abdul Hamid in the 1870s, things are not going well, suddenly you have people questioning the very idea that the house of Uthman has the legitimacy to rule. Suddenly, around this time in the 19th century, both on the Arabic and Turkish-speaking sides of the divide, people are beginning to ask, by what legitimacy does the Ottoman family rule? By what legitimacy does this dynasty rule? And so this is a problem that Sultan Abdul Hamid has to contend with. I'm going to skip a bunch of slides because these are things that we've covered, and I'm going to go, Brother Anwar, to slide number 9. I'm just telling him this for the live stream. There is a point that I'm going to make here, and this is a hill I'm willing to die on. Okay, it's a point I make very emphatically. There is no figure in modern Islamic history who is more hotly contested by historians than Sultan Abdul Hamid. Just by show of hands, how many of you have heard of Sultan Abdul Hamid? Okay. There's a really, really good possibility, just based on the audience that I'm dealing with, that your impression of Sultan Abdul Hamid is generally favorable. Okay? This is my suspicion. Most of the history books that were written about Sultan Abdul Hamid in the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s eviscerate him. He was widely hated in his time. And he's really it's a fascinating figure. And when I say widely hated, I don't mean universally hated. He also had people who loved him, right? He had people who benefited from his rule, he had people who enjoyed his rule, but he had a lot of people who hated him. And now that the Muslim world finds itself in a particularly weak state, some people look back at Sultan Abdul Hamid and ask questions like, what is better? I don't have an answer for this. It's just something for you guys to think about. Is it better to have a say in your governance? Or is it better to live under the rule of a benevolent tyrant? Is it better to have some instability, but to be able to have a say and to have a voice? Or is it better to have a despot, a tyrant, an authoritarian ruler, but one with good intentions? It's very, very hard. It's very hard to find any work of history that refers to Sultan Abdul Hamid and that does not have the word despot beside it. It's very hard to find that, even by historians who I consider somewhat sympathetic of Sultan Abdul Hamid's rule. So, if this was a 3-hour lecture, I'd have a stack of books here beside me, and I would start firing off what different historians have read about him. So have any of you ever heard of the historian George Antonius? He wrote a very famous book called The Arab Awakening. And the Arab Awakening is like, it's the blueprint for Arab nationalism, written in English. Okay, it's if you take like an Arab nationalism course in SFU or UBC or something like that, you are going to read George Antonius. And George Antonius really gives an impression very similar to the kind that you'd find in Lawrence of Arabia's 7 Pillars of Wisdom. Okay? And he despises Sultan Abdul Hamid. And he believes that it is the tyranny of Sultan Abdul Hamid that gave rise to Arab nationalism in the first place. But then you turn around and you read Abdul Latif al-Tibawi, right, who wrote books about Ottoman history 30 years after George Antonius, gives a wildly different impression. You read modern historians, you get a different impression again, and it seems like the more distance that we have between us and Sultan Abdul Hamid, the more that history seems to be vindicating him. I'm going to put as much evidence out there as I can, and I will let you guys decide. Sultan Abdul Hamid had the unrelenting goal of not allowing any more of his lands to be colonized by European powers. And Sultan Abdul Hamid, for like 28 years, was successful at that. For 28 years, the Muslims did not lose any more land. But the question is, at what cost? So Sultan Abdul Hamid was very invested in picking up where the Tanzimat left off, but in a more Islamically oriented direction. In other words, Sultan Abdul Hamid wanted an Ottoman identity, but an Ottoman identity that was rooted in Islam. Islam is the public space. Islam is normative. Islam is the religion of the empire, and we have Christian and Jewish minorities. But our Christian and Jewish minorities in this vision of Sultan Abdul Hamid are highly, highly, highly Islamicized. So Islam is what is normative, not the other way around. It's not that their way of thought or their way of life or their religions or their philosophies are what is normal. And Sultan Abdul Hamid really, really doubles down on his use of and his recognition as the caliph, as Amir al-Mu'mineen. And as part of this, he goes on a massive spree with money the empire does not have, and begins to repair Masjid and really to give the Islamic dimension of the empire a massive facelift. But one of the most interesting things, I always like to leave an audience with things that I think they maybe would not learn elsewhere. So one of the things that I've included here, and I really wish Imam Yahya was here, Sultan Abdul Hamid went on a massive campaign of spreading the Hanafi madhab throughout the Ottoman Empire. Now, why do you think that is? Like why? Keep in mind, all of the madhahib, all of the Sunni madhahib were like widely adhered to in the Ottoman Empire. Why the Hanafi madhab? This is why I wish Imam Yahya was here, because he would probably have the answer to this. Okay, so something you should know about the late Ottoman Empire. It might surprise you to know that in Greater Syria, including Palestine, the vast majority of villages, I'm going to say between half and 2/3, did not have masajid. And they did not have churches, and they did not have synagogues. They did not have buildings dedicated for worship. Now, does that mean that they didn't worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? No. Actually, in Palestine, oftentimes their worship or their masjid was built into the landscape. They would use a cave, a wadi, they would use potentially like a hilltop, sometimes they would use a home of a wealthy person, and that would double as a masjid. Oftentimes they would use a maqam, they would use a shrine that was the grave site of some, pious ancestor or something, that would also double as a masjid. But the reason why that's important is because if you're a alim, the key word in alim is ilm. Ulama like to read and they like to be around other ulama. So if your town doesn't even have a masjid, it's not likely that you're going to be able to recruit a full-time imam of real knowledge, like a full-time imam of real, what we would call like a classical Islamic education, who's going to live full-time in your town. The consequence, of course, is you would find, traveling through the late Ottoman Empire, a lot of Islamic practices that the people in this room would consider like somewhat heterodox, strange, and certainly not familiar to, again, most of the people in this room. So one part of this push to Hanafiyeize the empire was to build an Islamic orthodoxy. An Islamic orthodoxy that was also very much connected to the state. But that still doesn't explain why the Hanafi madhab. And that is because, particularly at that time, and probably still till today if you read books that are old enough, the Maliki, the Shafi'i, and the Hanbali madhab insisted that Amir al-Mu'mineen should be from Quraysh. The Hanafi madhab did not. And so it was also a matter of legitimizing the Ottoman dynasty. Now, I encourage you to take this up with Imam Yahya and pry him on it. This, by the way, this is like not a knock or anything on the Hanafi madhab. Like, please do not understand. I'm merely unpacking this for you to understand the multiple reasons why this was happening at that time. Okay. Now, despite this, all of these policies, this does not stop the constant flow of missionaries and the infiltration of these really like agents of European powers. And so Sultan Abdul Hamid cannot stop the missionaries from coming in. Remember from previous sessions, the missionaries are coming in with diplomatic immunity from the great powers of Europe. But Sultan Abdul Hamid could stop their books, which is what he started doing. He shut down printing presses, and he started seizing any books, what do they call them? Like the empire's official censor would seize any books that they did not feel to be appropriate with the state's messaging or the state's Islamic ethos. The problem with that is that you will inevitably throw out the baby with the bathwater. Meaning that if you're going to censor that much content, you're also going to end up shutting down well-meaning printing presses, right? Like this is going to happen. And if you're involved in the printing industry, and if you're involved in the production of books, and if you're involved in political thought or something, you are going to despise this. And this was widely despised. Again, try to put yourself in the shoes of Sultan Abdul Hamid. What would you do? Like, you are surrounded from all sides. You have all of the great powers of Europe circling like sharks in the water, and the water is full of Ottoman blood. So what do you do? Well, one problem that the Ottomans have is that their military is massively underperforming. I have to be really careful with how much time I spend on this, because I could speak about this next part for hours. In the early 1870s, shortly before Sultan Abdul Hamid ascends to the throne, an event happens in Europe that changes European history forever, and it's the Franco-Prussian War. And the Prussian general turned basically the equivalent of prime minister, Otto von Bismarck, not just believed, he spearheaded the effort to unite the German-speaking principalities. And these German-speaking principalities would not be united through an administrative regime, like a top-down administrative regime where you would just kind of start manipulating the boundaries of the empire. Otto von Bismarck believed that they would be united by blood and iron. And the Prussian heartland of these German-speaking principalities were highly, highly, highly industrialized, had the most sophisticated railroad system of anywhere in Europe. But more important than all of that, sorry, I'm getting some feedback noise from somebody has their phone open or something. So the Prussian railroad system was highly sophisticated, but more important than all of that, the Prussians had one of the most robust systems of military academies. And these military academies created what, I can't remember the name of the historian, but he wrote a book called A Nation in Barracks, where every citizen was a soldier and the soldier was the nation. And the Prussians ran through the French like they were a colony. It wasn't, the death toll was 10-1 or something. It wasn't even close. And at that time, the Ottomans had opened military academies with all French advisors. All of the instructors were from France. And by the time this happened, I think the Ottomans started to look at that and think, we have the wrong kind of advisors. We should be bringing in Prussians. And originally, and by this time, Germany had united. So the Germans initially rebuffed the Ottoman request to, basically help develop their military academy system. But they were eventually swayed, and they brought over a man named Colmar van der Goltz, who forever became known as Goltz Pasha. Okay? And he lived in the Ottoman Empire until until he died in the First World War, in fact. So he did live in the Ottoman Empire the whole time, or for the rest of his life. And Goltz Pasha helped develop this really robust military academy system, like a truly, truly robust military academy system, where children were recruited into tuition-free schools from age 6. And if you were really good, then you went to one of the schools in the regional capital. So you might go from Raqqa or something and study at a school somewhere. And then if you're really good, you'll go to Damascus. And then if you're really good, you'll go to, after high school, you'll go to a college called Maktab al-Ulum al-Harbiyya, like the Academy of Military Sciences in Istanbul. And if you're the best of the best of the best of the best, you'll go on to the Staff College. And in this way, Sultan Abdul Hamid laid the groundwork for a 30-year plan to develop an Ottoman military that was capable of confronting the great powers of Europe. The names of the graduates of this military academy, if you know anything about Arab or Turkish history, a lot of really important people attended these schools. In a single class, well, put it this way, these academies were so successful that between 1920 and 1958, nearly every single Iraqi prime minister was a graduate of the Ottoman Military Academy. Nearly every single one. And in a single class, you had Yassin al-Hashimi, right, one of the most famous and powerful Iraqi political leaders of that time, and in his class was Mustafa Kemal. Right? This was the crop that you were dealing with. And they were merit-based institutions. The problem is this. So far, I think I've given you an impression. I really am trying to be fair. and I think I've given you an impression of Sultan Abdul Hamid and the policies that he's pursued as well-intentioned and forward-thinking. On the other hand, there is no denying that Sultan Abdul Hamid was a reclusive autocrat who was very, very, very paranoid. So Sultan Abdul Hamid developed this military, but ensured that they had zero political power and influence whatsoever. Not only that, but he littered these military academies with spies. And he also, in the same way that he was confiscating books and literature and things like that outside of the military academies, he was also doing that inside the military academies. Not only that, but he was also making sure that the military graduates could not ever work anywhere outside of the military establishment. Right? So there were a lot of things that Sultan Abdul Hamid did to earn the resentment of the very military machine that he had created. This will come back to haunt him spectacularly later. There is one sin that hangs over the head of Sultan Abdul Hamid maybe more than any other. While Sultan Abdul Hamid was in power, there was a governor of Syria, a Turkish governor, who also was at some point a Grand Wazir, and who was one of the most remarkable, most efficient, most effective, most forward-thinking, most noble. Like the list of good qualities really are very long. And his name was Midhat Pasha. And as governor of Syria, he was remarkable in terms of the things that he accomplished. And Sultan Abdul Hamid had him strangled. And the reason he had him strangled is because he suspected that Midhat was going to grow so powerful that he would do to him what Muhammad Ali Pasha did to his ancestors. Okay? He feared Midhat Pasha, and he suspected Midhat Pasha had plans and desires to challenge his rule. Is there any legitimacy to Sultan Abdul Hamid's fears? I have seen no evidence that Midhat Pasha was anything short of a complete loyal subject. But that is something that continued to hang over the head of Sultan Abdul Hamid. And I want to point out something really interesting about how much the Ottoman Empire had changed by this point. 50 years prior to the killing of Midhat Pasha, the Ottoman Empire liquidated 10,000 Janissaries in like a week. So Sultan Abdul Hamid killed one guy, and it was not forgiven in the moment that it happened, and it continued to haunt him for the entirety of his reign. And that's how much the rule of law had changed in the Ottoman Empire over the course of the Tanzimat. Now, the problem with developing an army that is so sophisticated and so amazing in the Ottoman Empire of that time is the vast majority of war has very little to do with the actual fighting. Most of what we consider modern warfare is logistics. How do you move supplies? And so Sultan Abdul Hamid massively, I don't want to say he started, but he massively accelerated the single biggest infrastructural project in the history of Islam, and that is the Damascus to Hijaz Railway. The Damascus to Hijaz Railway ostensibly was to help make Hajj easier and safer. But the other purpose of the Damascus to Hijaz Railway is to move troops very, very quickly. Now, this is the Hijaz Railway is the most beautiful metaphor for the unity of the Muslims. because the Damascus to Hijaz Railway was really, truly the first and only ever pan-Islamic infrastructural project. The Ottomans went around the Muslim world collecting money for this project. And Muslims from what is modern day like India and Pakistan, Muslims from Indonesia, Muslims from all over North Africa donated to this project. Okay? This was paid for from like donations at masajid like this. And all of the great powers of Europe thought that it was impossible that this group of monkeys from the sick man of Europe were ever going to be able to accomplish the construction of this railway, but they did. And it reduced travel times in a way that like a generation before was unimaginable. But it also meant that Sultan Abdul Hamid and his secret police could travel internally through the Ottoman Empire much faster. At the same time, Sultan Abdul Hamid expanded the telegraph system. And the telegraph system made communicating with the Sultan, made communicating with the high port, made communicating with central figures very, very, very fast, the speed of electricity. But it also meant that the spies of Sultan Abdul Hamid could send their messages back to the high port also at just as fast. The telegraph is really interesting because on the one hand, the telegraph allowed for Ottoman subjects and now citizens, we can call them, allowed for Ottoman citizens to appeal directly to the Sultan and not to corrupt government officials who are, ruining their lives and who they're dealing with much more intimately. But like I said, on the other hand, it also allows for the state to spy on its citizens much more effectively as well. And both of these things were happening simultaneously. Now, actually, I've already talked about that a little bit, so I won't say too much there. What you must know is that all the while this was happening, the great powers of Europe never, ever, ever stopped intervening in Ottoman affairs. And they continued to devise plans to carve up the Ottoman Empire. While all of this was happening, Damascus to Hijaz Railway finishes right at kind of the turn of the 20th century, very, very early, first decade of the 20th century. Thousands upon thousands of people are using the railway on a regular basis. And one thing I don't have in these slides is that the relationship with the German Empire continues to grow. Kaiser Wilhelm II visits Al-Quds in 1896, and he also sponsors the construction of the Berlin to Baghdad railway. So now you have a railway that goes north-south, and you have the Berlin to Baghdad railway never finishes, but it reaches Palestine, and that one goes east-west. Huge infrastructural projects, but the great powers of Europe never stop meddling. And nationalism is gaining a lot of steam in Europe at this time. And there are a few things that emerge as a result of this nationalism. In England, we think of national identities right now as primarily ethnic and linguistic identities. But in the European imagination of the time, national identities were ethno-religious linguistic identities. So Russia is the home of the Rus people who are Orthodox Christians. France is a primarily secular place, but they see themselves as the champions of global Catholicism. So too do the Italians. The British are an Anglican people. They speak English, but their religion is also an Anglican Christianity, and they are primary patrons of a Protestant Christianity around the world. But all of them agree on one thing: the Jews don't belong to us. So the Jews that we have, they are not us. Okay? They might speak German, they might look like us, they might dress like us, but they are not us. And the Russians felt very much the same way, and so they confined their Jewish population to a place called the Pale of Settlement. Largely as a consequence of this anti-Semitism, European Jewry responded to this pressure cooker in 3 ways. 4 ways. One was assimilation. No, غصبًا عنهم, we will assimilate. They will accept us. We will make them accept us. We are going to be more British than the British. We are going to be more German than the Germans. We are going to be more Russian than the Russians. We are going to leave our ghettos. We are going to leave our ethnic enclaves. We are going to integrate. Another option was America. When I say America, I don't just mean the United States of America. In the thinking of the time, even for the Arabic-speaking world, America meant the entire New World. Argentina, Brazil, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Canada. All of that was like the Americas. It was especially used that way by Arabs. But anyways, the idea was go to the New World. This is a place where the prejudices of Europe are not as deeply rooted. Yes, we will face some racism, we'll face some discrimination, but eventually they'll get over it because everyone there is new. Everyone's looking after a fresh start. By far, well, actually, assimilation was probably the most popular option, but another very, very popular option, something very enticing to European Jews, was the idea of socialism. The idea that your brother is not the one who prays to the same God or speaks the same language or looks like you. Your brother is the one who toils in the mines, who works in the factories, who has coal-covered hands and, soot-covered faces. That's your brother, right? And that was a message the Jews could get on board with because it left the door open for them, right? They were not there. The barrier to entry was not there. As long as they were working class, and most of them were working class, they could join this new brotherhood of socialists. And so when a socialist conspiracy killed Tsar Alexander II, 1882, right? 2 out of the 3 of the assassins were Jewish, and the Russian peasants lost their minds and went on a spree of pogroms, just pillaging through Jewish villages all over Russia. Right? So now the vibe of anti-Semitism has reached even newer heights. And there was another option, which was to establish a homeland somewhere else. We want a nation state like all of the other nation states. They considered Uganda, they considered Argentina. But because the stories of the Bible already kind of wrote the script for them, many felt that Palestine would be the most appropriate place for a Jewish homeland. This is where the prophets of Bani Israel were born and died. This is where many of their stories are rooted to. And despite having not seen it in 2,000 years or whatever it is, they felt that this could be a very legitimate homeland. Now, I want to note something very quickly before I move on, and that is that Christian Zionism predates European Jewish Zionism by something like 300 years. In the 16th century, there were already Christians believing that the Jews should be shipped out of, primarily motivated by anti-Semitism, the Jews should be shipped out of Europe and into Palestine. This was already an idea hundreds of years before the first Jewish Zionist thought of an idea like that. And in the Christian imagination, what was going to happen was that, let's ship them all there, and then Isa alayhi salam is going to come back and kill them all. This is the way that the thinking went in the 16th century, right? But by the 19th century, you have a new brand of Zionism, a Jewish Zionism. And this is the point where a young Austrian journalist named Theodor Herzl walks into the Sultan's palace to make him a pretty enticing offer. Now, something about this story should already grab your attention. Do you think like any baboon off the street could just walk into Sultan Abdul Hamid's court? So Europe already had an idea about the tentacles of the Jews stretching all over the world and their incredible power and influence and money and all of these things, which for Theodor Herzl were largely nonsense. He didn't have access to all of these things. But he, like many other Zionists, leaned on the anti-Semitism of Europeans that gave him superpowers that he didn't have. Right? So if he was knocking on doors on the doors of people who had a presumption that he had power and influence that he did not actually have. This is something the Zionists leveraged quite effectively for essentially their entire existence. Theodor Herzl approaches Sultan Abdul Hamid with an offer to buy Palestine, right? To purchase Palestine and to turn it into a Jewish province in the Ottoman Empire. Okay? And it will, and by doing this, the Jews of the world will absolve the Ottomans of their debt. They have a massive debt. And the key holders of the debt are every great power in Europe. The Ottomans, by this point, I haven't really mentioned it to you guys, are not in control of their own finances. That's how dire the situation has gotten. So Theodor Herzl, leaning on the anti-Semitic tropes of Europe, says the Jews will be able to pay off your debt. You'll be made whole, and we'll be loyal subjects in the Ottoman world. Sultan Abdul Hamid responds, and this is probably the reason why most of you have a positive impression of Sultan Abdul Hamid. This, more than anything else, is what Sultan Abdul Hamid is remembered for now. He says, quote, "I cannot sell even a foot of land, for it does not belong to me, but to my people. My people have won this empire by fighting for it with their blood and have fertilized it with their blood. We will again cover it with our blood before we allow it to be wrested away from us." Look, Sultan Abdul Hamid was not perfect. I think I've made that case very clear. But I would take 1,000 Sultan Abdul Hamids over the den of thieves that we have to deal with today. Yeah, no, he wasn't perfect, but he stood for something. He had some principles. I look at the Muslim world right now and I think, I don't like the assumption of, the reckless assumptions of kufr and nifaq. I will give these rulers the assumption of iman. I will give them that. But then I have to ask them, when you see what is happening in Gaza, when you see this, what will you say to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? You had these armies, you have these weapons, you have the resources, you can do something, and you've chosen to do nothing. And for all of Sultan Abdul Hamid's faults, he stood for something. By 1908, there are secret societies all over the Ottoman Empire, all over. And these secret societies have emerged from the dining halls of the military academies that Sultan Abdul Hamid sponsored. These are the most intelligent, the most well-equipped, the most professional, the most literate, competent, organized of all the Ottoman subjects. And Sultan Abdul Hamid has done everything in his power to undermine them. And Sultan Abdul Hamid discovers that there is a cell in Salonika to a secret society that has been banned. And so he summons them to be court-martialed. And when they are court-martialed and inevitably found guilty, they will be hanged. So some of those in that cell think, if we're going to be arrested anyway, then we should go out guns blazing. Like, either way, we're dying. Like, khalas, let's go for it. And so they launch a raid on the high port, on Sultan Abdul Hamid's palace. And to their surprise, they successfully launch a coup and overthrow Sultan Abdul Hamid. And suddenly, they have an empire to manage. Like, one of the least known things about the 1908 coup is that to the conspirators of the coup, it was a long shot. Like, they didn't really think that they were going to pull it off, but their back was against the wall, and they did it. Sultan Abdul Hamid abdicates, but a year later, there is a counter coup that definitely had his fingerprint. And so in 1909, Sultan Abdul Hamid is exiled, but he is not killed. The charge that justifies his exile, or one of the many charges that justify his exile, the murder of Midhat Pasha. So, on the one hand, Sultan Abdul Hamid was, and I put here the last gasp of the old world. He was an emperor in the age of the nation state. And all of these, like, utterly stupid characterizations of Sultan Abdul Hamid as like a regressive, backward zealot are all nonsense. He accelerated every single modernization campaign that the Tanzimat had started, all with a significantly more Islamic character. On the other hand, Sultan Abdul Hamid is overthrown in 1908, and in 1909, Bosnia is annexed to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. 1 year without Sultan Abdul Hamid, and the empire rapidly went back to losing territory to the great powers of Europe. And so I'm fascinated by Sultan Abdul Hamid because he is a truly complex character. He is a truly, truly complex character that you would, I feel like you would genuinely want to sit down with him and to kind of go through his mind, like go through his thought process. And I keep coming back, like, look, I'm sure you can tell this isn't the first time that I've thought about these things. And I keep coming back to the same question, what could he have done differently? I think, Abu Yusuf, you asked me this question, I think, last week, right? Or something to that effect. And if it wasn't you, it was it seems like they made all of the wrong decisions, right? But then fine, okay, fine, they made all of the wrong decisions. What would you do? I don't mean like, I'm asking you rhetorically, what would any of us do? Like, if you are in Sultan Abdul Hamid's shoes, you are not playing in a level playing field. You understand, there was something that the Europeans saw as a civilizational standard. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had similar rates of like industrialization and literacy and suffrage to the Ottoman Empire. Okay, very, very similar. But the Austro-Hungarians were allowed to develop all of their institutions free from the tentacles of the great powers of Europe. Okay? It's not like everyone was reading and writing in France. Contrary to what they would like to think, they weren't. Like, universal literacy is a relatively new thing, mostly like a post-World War II thing. Okay? The Russian Empire was in ruins. Like, it needed a huge overhaul, but they were able to do that without the intervention of the other great powers of Europe. The Ottomans did not have that advantage. This is driving a truck downhill with the engine on fire, and people are shooting at you from the inside of the truck. You understand? Like, this is the circumstance, this is the level of hysteria that we're dealing with. And so, I don't know what I would have done differently. But Sultan Abdul Hamid is overthrown in 1908, really officially overthrown in 1909. And the last chapter that we will cover is the era of the Young Turks, the CUP, the Committee for Union and Progress, the ones that overthrew Sultan Abdul Hamid. I will, what do you have, till 7:45, 7:50? 10 minutes for question and answer. I'd like, just like last week, I made a little note about contemporary politics, things that are happening in the world right now, particularly what's happening in Palestine. So I do want to say something. How many of you are under 30 years old? Okay, mashallah, good. Okay, then this is like, please listen to me very carefully. Okay. For the last 20 years, 20 years since the American invasion of Iraq, we as Muslims have been building alliances of solidarity with our partners and our friends, and it is all nonsense. All of it. We have seen it right now, like right now with Gaza. Look, Frantz Fanon is the most quoted author in anti-colonialism and anti-colonial struggles. And if you read The Wretched of the Earth, Al-Bu'asa al-Ard, al-Ard, if you've heard of this book before, okay? Frantz Fanon's first line is, at its most fundamental level, anti-colonialism smells of bloody knives and red-hot cannonballs. Yeah. And in every high school and in every university in North America, there is like a department of anti-colonial studies where people have made a career off of writing about liberation, decolonization, anti-colonialism, centering colonized voices, blah, 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 blah. Look, I have personally, I don't need to go far, I have personally had people reach out to me very recently who completely sold us out. Like people who I thought, based on the books that they've written and the things that they've said, I thought like, these people are with Palestine till the end. Like they are with Palestine. They are going to march through the gates of Masjid al-Aqsa. They're going to march through Bab al-Amud with us. And they sold us out. So here is my lesson to everyone who is under 30. I am not telling you, close the doors of solidarity. I'm not saying that. Whether it's your Palestinian activism, whether it's your Islamic activism, whether it's anything else that you're doing, I am not telling you close the doors of activism. What I'm telling you is this. Under no circumstance do they steer the ship. We steer the ship, they take a seat. They are along for the journey. If you're on the journey to the liberation of Masjid al-Aqsa, we steer the ship and you get off whenever you feel like it. The only reason you are on this ship is because your support for us is unconditional. You provide your services when they are needed, and you will listen when you are spoken to. But they do not take the lead, ever, because their support of us and anything that we do is conditional upon us behaving in the way that they want. Many of these people have made entire careers. They've written books that could fill this room about the liberation of Palestine and the liberation of Algeria and anti-colonial struggles in Egypt and in India and wherever. كل حكي فاضي. It is all just talk. Just talk. But the moment that things got real, قال إني بريء منكم إني أرى ما لا ترون إني أخاف الله والله شديد العقاب. They, just like shaitan, they turn their heels on us. Okay? Be very wary, especially for those who are under 30 and are involved and in the community and doing these things. Keep the doors open, keep everyone in their place. Okay, any questions?